Welcome to this Friends at Home event sponsored by the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. In celebration of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, tonight we are joined by local Alameda author Karin Jensen, highlighting her book, The Strength of Water, an Asian American Coming-of-Age Memoir. I am T.C. Curry from the Friends of the Alameda Library, a nonprofit organization raising funds and advocating for our outstanding public library in this beautiful city of Alameda, California. These events are free, but you will not be surprised to learn that we appreciate donations. A little later, you'll see a link for donations in the chat thread and a QR code on the slide at the end of the evening. We appreciate any donations, large or small, to support these virtual events, as well as many in real life programs conducted by the library. Before we get started, you should know that this is a live webinar and it is being recorded and will be posted later on YouTube. Your microphone and camera are turned off, so please use the chat to introduce yourself, to let us know where you are calling from, and to ask questions. We will try to get to all of your questions towards the end of the program. We request that the chat is used respectfully. It is being monitored and we will cut off anyone who is disrespectful. So enough about mechanics, let's move on. Karin writes local news stories for the Alameda Post and participates in the To Live and Write in Alameda Writers Group. Since 2021, she has won Newsbreak editorial awards, one for the topic of hashtag Stop Asian Hate and one on hashtag AAPI Voices. For her work, Authority magazine has named her a social impact author in 2021. The Strength of Water is her mother's story of growing up in Detroit, then China, then the San Francisco Bay Area, where she settled and worked as a waitress in iconic restaurants in San Francisco and the East Bay. Born in 1923, she spent her early years in her family's laundry, learning to press and wrap clothes, isolated in the Chinese community in Detroit. Her father took his family back to his remote ancestral village in China after her mother died to find a new wife. He left his 6 children there with his new wife so he could pay off debts. After several years, he paid for her passage back, where she lived with relatives, finding her way in the Bay Area. She married twice and had many adventures. So please join me in welcoming Karin Jensen to our program. Karin, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me. I am so thankful to be here this evening and appreciative. I love what the Friends of the Library do.
Cool. Yeah. So could you read a bit from the book as an introduction to your work?
Yeah. I'm going to read from the very opening of the book because I think it just kind of sets the scene. And this is from the perspective of when I interviewed her in the early 2000s when she was in her 80s. Here's the opening. In my heyday, I was a bit over 5 feet tall. Today, I am 4 feet 8 inches. I'm a little person, but I have lived a big life. China, the country of my heritage, traded silk for gold with Rome and Carthage, and millennia after the Roman Empire and Carthage fell, China still endures. I like to think of myself that way. I did not have much formal education or encouragement as I was growing up. Some think my ways are a little backward, but I have persisted. During my life, I have been criticized as sometimes too boisterous, or sometimes too quiet, or sometimes not smart enough, or sometimes not big enough. Still, as long as I try my best, I know that I have value and am deserving. The most important thing I have looked for is an appreciation for who I am, which is hard to find in the world. Cultural and educational barriers are difficult to overcome. Those we love most are sometimes our greatest detractors. However, where once I shared 2 rooms with 8 family members, now I live in a hilltop home with a view of San Francisco. Where once I did not have the opportunity to finish high school, now both my daughters have college degrees. Where once I was alone and lonely, now I have family and friends. This is my story. So that's the opening.
That's wonderful. You say in the acknowledgments that you started writing the book in 2002. Can you talk us through the process of writing the book and its journey to publication?
It really goes even farther back than 2002. By way of background, I grew up in Piedmont, which is quite close by here, where my family didn't really fit in exactly. My mother was a waitress. My father was a school teacher. My peers did debutante balls and world traveling, and I didn't. I lived with my parents in a 2-bedroom, 1-bath home next to a mansion so large that the property extended from one street to another street. So it was a little bit like being Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. And my mother, in this milieu, my mother told stories of growing up in her father's Detroit laundry business. And when I say growing up in the business, they were in a few rooms behind the laundry in the commercial district during the infancy of the automobile industry, and later in the Cantonese village, as you mentioned, on the eve of the Sino-Japanese War. She also spoke of what it was like to be a live-in domestic worker and a teen waitress in mid-century California. And there were stories of gamblers, an American dream, dashed hopes, dangerous superstitions, wartime privations, folklore, those who take advantage of the economically vulnerable, racism in housing, toxic expectations relating to sexuality and marriage. But there were also stories of persistence and resilience, the warmth and the strength of the web of your family, the kindness of strangers, and fighting for one's little slice of happiness in the world. And these stories felt like a mythology growing up here in middle-class America, so removed from my experience. I found them fascinating. When I decided to set them down, I could hear her voice so clearly that I wrote in the first person. I formally interviewed my mom, aunts, uncle, sister, and a little my dad in the 2000s, but it wasn't until the pandemic that I polished up the manuscript and started to send it out. I don't have a background in publishing. I didn't know anything about how to get started. And it was funny, right at this time, just as COVID was hitting, and I was thinking that I would like to try to publish this. This woman at my church came in during fellowship, and she said, "Hey guys, I published a book and it's down at Books Inc. and I want you all to come." And she had some flyers out, and her name was Helen. And it was, my mother's name was Helen. And it felt like this little, like the voice of the universe going, go talk to her. And so I said, Helen, this is wonderful. And I have a book I want to publish too. Could I like pick your brain over coffee and ask you, how do you do this? And she said, oh, sure. And she was really generous with her advice. And so she gave me a lot of good advice. And then I started sending it out. And it was 42 queries before I found the right publisher, the right fit, which I've heard is not totally unheard of.
It's very typical.
Yeah. You're trying to find the person that fits and wants to publish the kinds of story that you have. But yeah, COVID put everything into focus. I felt like I could not die without getting this story into the world. And that's kind of how it came about.
Was there something you were talking about interviewing your aunts and, your family members, like formally interviewing? What was the most surprising thing that came out of that experience, or a couple of the things that really, really surprised you?
Oh gosh. I mean, I had been hearing these stories since I was little, but I think as an, we've all had this experience as readers where you read a good book when you're young, and then 10 or 20 years later, it hits you differently, or you notice different things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the stories that I enjoyed most as a child were the sort of the cinematic stories, the ones that I felt like I could imagine being almost in a movie.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned, one of the most remarkable aspects of my mother's story is how she grew up in Detroit until she was 12, when her mother died suddenly, leaving steep medical debts. And then to keep the children together, her father sent her and her siblings to live in his ancestral village in China. And there he kept them cheaply while he returned to the US to pay down bills. So imagine, if you will, living really poorly, what we would consider poorly here in the United States, in a couple of rooms in the commercial district, behind a laundry with your 5 siblings, and then step back in time 100 years to basically a third world village without electricity, plumbing, or telephone, and throw in malaria and really dangerous superstitions about healthcare and working in rice paddies and raising vegetables and animals to eat, which they had never done before. They had been working in a laundry. And then the start of the Sino-Japanese War happens. And that was the situation that my mother had to survive before she could even begin to pursue her American dream. Maybe can I read a passage about what it was like to arrive in the village? So this is as they're approaching the village after they've been living in America. Well, they grew up in America. In Hong Kong, we waited 2 days for the arrival of a river junk boat that would take us up to my father's village. We stayed in a hotel, and while my father went to take care of some business, my sisters, brother, and I stayed in the room and kept each other company. There was a button on one of the walls, and baby brother James liked to push it. This caused a woman from room service to come up and inquire about what we needed. When she found that we were Chinese Americans whose mother had died and whose father was returning to China to seek a new wife, she waited for Ba to return and offered to marry him on the spot. Ba thanked her, but said that his mother had already made arrangements for him through a matchmaker at home. I could not help but feel sorry for the young woman and wondered what circumstances prompted her to offer herself in such a way with so little inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
The junk boat journeyed up to the Pearl River. The junk boat journeyed up the Pearl River from Hong Kong to our village for 1 day and night. There were no private sleeping quarters as there had been on the steamboat. Instead, we slept with the other ship's passengers in one great room on the floor, with ropes hanging in rows above our heads. At the end of each cord was a heavy metal hook onto which passengers hooked their belongings. So as we slept, bundles, packages, and hooks swayed and creaked over our heads. I thought again of how pleased and excited my mother would have been if she were with us. As for me, I could not help but observe that conditions on the Chinese junk were more primitive and uncomfortable than conditions on the Canadian steamship. I wondered what further privations we would soon endure. When we arrived, a considerable portion of the village came out to gawk at us and followed us in a mob to my grandmother's house. Many of them had seen Chinese men dressed in the American style as they returned from the United States. This district was impoverished. Any family who could save enough to send even one son, father, or uncle to the United States, Singapore, or Philippines to earn some money to send home did so. Almost none, however, had ever seen females dressed and groomed in the Western style. This was long before the days of television. Moreover, not even radio or magazines were available in this remote place. In the village, all women dressed similarly. Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped something. Their hair, an elderly woman remarked as she stared disapprovingly at our short bobbed styles. It sticks out and pokes the earth god. It was immediately apparent that where we had been foreign in the country of our birth, we would also be foreign in the land of our heritage.
Mhm.
In Western nations, society had begun to see women's legs some 15 years before. Even in Hong Kong, women of fashion wore long silk dresses with slits that revealed their legs. This was unheard of in the village. Our legs, seen below the hem of our knee-length dresses, were the cause of much comment. When we got to grandmother's house and went in, the mob still peered in at the door. They piled, what struck me was that no one stood directly in the center of the doorway. They piled on each other, on the edges of the door, wishing to keep protection from our strangeness. However, we did nothing more compelling than meet and greet our grandmother, uncle, and aunt, and began to unpack. The crowd started to disperse until just one little boy stood at the door. Finally, he hissed at me through the doorway. "Are you wearing any pants under there?" "Of course I am," I said, blushing and thinking of my underwear. Said the boy, and he ran off. So that was what it was like. I think those kind of stories, those cinematic stories, kind of struck me a lot when I was a child. I think as an adult, I looked at some stories, as I said, a little bit differently. There was a point, well, let me back up. My grandparents kept having children because they were trying to get a boy. Because in Chinese traditional culture, it's the son who takes care of the parents. The son is your social security. And the daughters leave the family and go join other families. And they kept having daughter after daughter after daughter. And it was the Great Depression. They were not doing well financially. It was really hard on my grandmother's health. And at some point, my grandfather said of the two youngest little girls, my aunties, he said, "We should just put these two under a blanket and let them suffocate." And as a child, I thought, Grandpa was so mean. But as an adult, I thought, why would he even say that? Where did that come from? How would you even think to say that? And come to find out through research that infanticide has permeated a lot of societies, many societies through history during periods of famine.
Right.
And my grandfather was born in the late 19th century, and there was a lot of famine in China during the late 19th century. And I think he was repeating the survival wisdom of his ancestors in a way. And I think that was confirmed because when I asked my mother, well, what did you think? And she said, I knew he was angry, but I didn't think he was going to do that. I had heard other adult men say that sort of thing in a blowing off steam kind of way, but they never did that. And I was like, you heard other, that was something you heard other adults in your life saying. And so I just think these were all men born in that late 19th century and hearing that sort of thing. Unfortunately, of course, he didn't act on it. But yeah, just looking at it a little differently as an adult versus a child.
Well, and as a man who's supporting 6 kids and a wife and not being able to support them, if that is in your culture, it's an idea that you have, because if there are 2 less kids, then you're better able to care for your wife and the remaining children.
Yeah.
not that that excuses it,
Right,
but
right. Yeah.
but you know, culturally, you have to think about these things.
Well, it definitely reflects a level of poverty and desperation that
Yeah.
we can't even imagine
Right,
here. I mean, this comes from a period before there's food banks, before there's emergency shelters, before there's any government assistance.
right,
Famine means the fabric of society is falling apart.
right, right.
Yeah.
We are so blessed.
Yes,
So,
we are. Yeah.
so she's in China. Her dad leaves and goes back to Detroit, where he works and sends money to his new wife. And she's there for 4 years, right? Until she's 16.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and one of the things I do love about the stories is how often the kindness of strangers plays an outsized role in her fate.
Hmm.
They're often small kindnesses or small acts, but they mean all the world to one who has nothing. And you just mentioned it, like she was in China. So for 4 years, she suffered malaria, and her stepmother was trying to administer cures based on superstition, which actually made her condition so much worse.
Hmm.
And she ended up having a disease of vitamin deficiency called beriberi, which is a
Hmm.
disease of B vitamin deficiency. She lost the power to walk, and her family thought she was going to die. And she was just fighting with her whole soul and spirit to believe that she could get better. And so maybe I'll read another passage. Here's kind of an example of one of these little small acts that makes a huge difference. And this is when she can no longer walk. A few days later, a miracle happened. I could hear Seem, which was her stepmother, talking outside with some ladies. One said, "Why don't you mix some hompe," which means rice bran, "with water and see if she'll eat that?" Hompe was a rough food usually thrown out to the pigs, but nutritious and filled with B vitamins. This remedy was the simplest yet recommended, but where the other treatments spoke only to the spirit, which was already strong, this spoke to my body, which was weak. I never learned the identity of this woman. I only heard her voice, yet she saved my life. The boiling hompe smelled so good that I ate the whole bowl that Seem gave me. Seeing that I ate it, she gave me more, and then some more. As the days passed, the more I ate, the stronger I became. I began to move and to turn myself. Seem took me off the death board and put me back in bed. After some weeks, I could sit up, and she began to hold me under my arms to practice standing. And then something amazing happened. One day, Seem propped me up on a chair at our kitchen table where I could look out the door at the footpath, and suddenly a neighbor came running up. "Somebody's at the gate, she said. "They've got a letter for King Ying." That was my mother's Chinese name. A letter always caused excitement, and since the war had begun, they came less frequently. My whole family ran down to the gate. After a time, through the door, I could see Seem and my siblings hurrying up the path with my letter. Suddenly, my whole body felt light. I stood up. But I had forgotten that I was not able to stand up. I was more spirit than substance then. I fell forward on my face and my knees. My family rushed in to pick me up and sit me back on my chair. I was flushed and teary with excitement. My sisters opened the letter and began to read. It was from Uncle Philip, our mother's brother who lived in California. "Dear Helen," it read, "we heard you have been sick, and we are worried about you. We hope you're getting better. The letter went on with many kind thoughts and wishes for me, and inside was some money. This was the best, luckiest day of my life. I had never received a whole letter and some money just for me. Seam soon took care of the money. Every cent was needed to buy food for the family. Still, I knew it had been there. I knew that someone halfway around the world had thought that I was important enough to send me their kind wishes and thoughts and that money. How fortunate that this of all letters should make it through the sometimes unreliable wartime postal system. I took this as a great omen of hope. The more I thought about it, the better I felt, until I sat there glowing with happiness. From that day forward, I continued to grow stronger. So, a letter, a letter and a little money to give her some hope again. And there's just a number of examples like that. Another one of my favorite stories was when she is returning to the United States and she arrives at Angel Island. And they're looking for her paperwork, her proof of citizenship, and she doesn't have the right papers. And so they go, well, stand over there, we'll have to figure that out later. We got to process the rest of these people. And she's going, well, what's going to happen to me? And she goes, well, you may be deported because you don't have your proof of citizenship, but, we'll have to talk about that later. She's 16 by herself. My grandfather had sent money for one person to come back. She was the oldest kid, so she was the first. And there's only one Chinese person who works on the ship. It's the cook. And she goes to him and says, please, can you help me? And can you send a message to my uncle in Chinatown? I'll write for you the address. And please tell him I'm here and I need help. And he could have said, no, that's not my job. I don't,
Right.
sorry. But he said, yes, I will help you. And he took her message on his own time. He went and found her uncle in Chinatown. She had a very anxious 24 hours, hoping that he was going to keep his word. And he did. And her uncle was able to wire up to Seattle. She had left the United States from Seattle. Their immigration office wired down to Angel Island, and within 24 hours, she was released. But so many little things like that.
I just can't imagine when I read this passage, I can't imagine the desperation. Like, she's lived in this third world country for 4 years. She's coming back to and it's like, oh no, you may be deported. Like,
right.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And just a number of things like that, where somebody had to kind of help her a little bit. She always kind of thought that was like maybe her guardian angel, like coming in.
Yeah.
Well,
then she stays with her uncle for a while. And then there was an idyllic couple of years there, and then she needs to get a job, right?
Yeah. And so, yeah, we're talking about like the kindness of strangers, but conversely, as you say, she and later my aunties then start working as live-in domestic workers, and later she works as a waitress. And that's a really interesting perspective, I think, because they're working for well-to-do families. I mean, to be able to live in somebody's home and just do all the cooking and cleaning. To see wealthy or well-to-do people from the perspective of the person on the lowest rung and how they get treated in the privacy of their own home is kind of eye-opening. And sadly, really without exception, they all got treated rather shabbily. So I think that's kind of just an interesting type of story to read.
It is, but it also exposes her to a level of living that she had just not seen before.
Yeah.
And that she started aspiring to, and eventually she ended up having for herself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I almost think that aspiration started when she was even living in the laundry, because it's when she went to school and she realized her classmates were going home to homes and she was going to live in the back of a laundry. And then she was too embarrassed to invite anybody to where she was living.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really kind of the start of the aspiration that someday I'm going to have my own home that's not a rented place, that's not in the back of a business. I want my own home. And that was really kind of the start of the dream in a ways. Yeah. But yeah, also living in other people's homes and kind of going, wow, everybody gets their own bedroom, really?
Yeah, right. Like, this is interesting.
Yeah.
So she goes from being a domestic to being a waitress, and it's a step up for her
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. And then her father comes back to San Francisco and is very ashamed of her because there's some sort of cultural thing about being a waitress that I wasn't right clear about. I knew he was ashamed that she was a waitress, but I'm like, so a live-in domestic is better than a waitress? I mean, I'm not sure what he was expecting of her.
I know. I agree. I don't know what he could possibly expect of her, given that he had provided her with so little. I mean, he provided her with a ticket to come back,
Right.
but then, he's kind of an interesting character because he had to start working and living on his own as a teenager as well.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what he did for his kids. It's like, well, I got you to teenagerhood. That's all I'm doing.
Right.
um, and I'm sorry, I lost track of what your question was.
Well, I was just
Oh,
saying
why was he ashamed?
ashamed of her. Yeah.
Um, it seemed culturally sort of women serving in a public way somehow was kind of,
Ah,
it's kind of like there was this story that surprised me where she said eventually one of her sister-in-laws, when they went out to a restaurant, apparently in these older Chinese restaurants at that time, you could have a curtain
mm-hmm.
around your table. Like you could kind of go into a booth and then close the curtain. And it was like she didn't want to be on display. It was like women are in the home, a woman, a lady, I should say, is in the home and she's not on display and she's not out in the public and, serving the public. So it's, I think, hard to understand culturally, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, along those same lines, it was surprising to me that more attention was not paid to marrying her off. I mean,
Yeah.
she basically found this guy on her own.
Right.
She had no input from her family. She didn't even meet his family until after they got married.
Yeah.
And I was really shocked by that. It's like, how would you not, I mean, as a white person, we hear all of, culturally matching and matchmaking, and you have to make sure that the astrology is right between the couples, and is there good fortune or bad aspects, and we have to, like, all of these things have to be considered. And she's like, meets this guy waitressing and decides that he was really nice to her and took her out some, and wasn't treated her well. And then they get married and she meets his family. I mean, and
Right.
it's like, oh,
Yeah, she was so on her own.
yeah.
I can't I can't really explain my grandfather exactly. I did know him, but I wasn't really able to communicate well with him because of the language barrier. And I'm
Mhm.
not sure I would have had the courage to ask him certain probing questions of like, why didn't you take better care of my mom?
Right, right.
um, um, I can only say that he also lived a very hard life.
Mhm.
his father had gone to the United States supposedly to send money back to his mother and him, but he was kind of not the most responsible guy, and he wasn't sending money back consistently. And finally his mother said, okay, it's down to you. Your father's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. I'm sending you off as a teenager, and you have to get a job and send money back to us so we can survive. And he did. He actually did that. I mean, as a teenager, somehow he got work as a laborer, and he was the responsible one that sent money. But somehow I'm speculating that because he had to be on his own as a teenager, that's how he treated all his kids. It was like, okay, I got you up to 16 or 17. I'm done.
Right. You're on your own.
And I think it would have been her mother that would have
Right.
really kind of done the arranging. Her mother was gone. And I think a poignant story is the one female relative who took an interest in her Aunt Emily. Finally, my mother's about 20 and says, oh, King Ying, I want you to find a nest. And the irony is, my mother was doing fine. She had a job, she was paying her bills, she had a place to live. But there's that old view, not even just in Chinese culture, because I've experienced this a little bit in generation of, I want to see you settled.
Right.
I don't think you're going to be quite okay until you're married and settled down. And so her Aunt Emily was saying this too. I want you to find a nest, but yet I can't really blame my Aunt Emily. Her Aunt Emily, she had her own family, 4 kids and a business to run and all of this. So she didn't go the extra step to actually try to introduce her to suitable people.
Right.
After a lifetime of deprivation, her first husband was taking her out to nightclubs and restaurants. And then when he asked her to marry her, she thought of her Aunt Emily's advice, like, well, Aunt Emily says I should find a nest. So, okay, let's do that. And so, but then, it ended up being a very, very unhappy marriage. And I think this is you were asking about, things that struck you as an adult versus a child. I think this is the thing that most struck me more as an adult. Understanding the degree to which marriage gave status to women and divorce stripped you of status. And I'm speaking probably more before the 1970s, because it seemed like in the 70s with the women's liberation movement, that attitude started to change a little bit. But even in my generation, I remember that vocabulary of, oh, you got a good catch, or, oh, you got him, good for you. Of course, we all want to find somebody to love, but when it's presented as this trophy that you have to win by a certain deadline, it's hard on all of us. It's hard on men and women. And it was so much more in her time period. A divorced woman was not viewed or treated with the same respect as a married woman. And it was true in American culture, where the divorcee could be the subject of crude jokes.
Right.
But it was especially true in Chinese culture, where you were a disgrace to the family. And so the stigma was so intense that women like my mother would stay in really unhappy marriages rather than risk what they thought was even worse, which was kind of the shunning of their community and their family.
Right. Especially once you have a child.
Yeah.
Right. Because then it's not just you, you're exposing your child to that sort of shame as well. But eventually she does.
Yeah. After many years and a lot of courage, she found the courage to leave. And the situation is different today, but it makes me reflect just on how much family and culture shape what we think is even possible for ourselves, and how lonely it is to defy social norms, even when those norms are harming you.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I really enjoyed was she waitressed at all of these like really iconic
Yeah.
restaurants. She starts out at someplace really local to Oakland and then ends up in the Tonga room,
Yeah.
you know. It's
Yeah.
like,
The Tonga Room is, for those who don't know, it's a really famous Polynesian
Polynesian,
Polynesian style restaurant, a tiki restaurant. That's what I'm trying to think of.
right?
It's sort of the classic, they became really popular, I think, in the 50s, 60s, 40s,
Mhm.
where you have kind of kitschy Polynesian decor and, Mai Tai drinks in little, you know, I can't think of all the terms, but it's a famous restaurant in the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. There's in this restaurant, there's a pool with sprinklers that go on, and they have a storm that goes off. Anyway, yeah, it's a famous restaurant.
So she eventually meets her second husband at a diner that she's working at in Oakland,
Mhm.
right? And this is another kind of, she repeats the story. It's like she meets this guy, he treats her really well. She says, hey, maybe he can provide for me. She marries him. He's from Oklahoma. She doesn't meet his family until a while into the marriage, and then they go down to Oklahoma. And that was a really fun part of the book to
Yeah,
read, because
yeah,
she's like, whoa, talk about culture shock. And
yeah,
her in-laws were very gracious.
yeah,
And so that was good.
yeah, yeah,
Because I was kind of worried when she went there, but it was really lovely. And but it's like, I'm out here, I've got to do this on my own. I'm going to marry this person. I don't know who his family is. I don't, will do a crapshoot, I guess.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because, like, after she was divorced, at first, like, all of her friends, like, I say in the book, nature abhors a vacuum, and the
Yeah.
Chinese abhor a single woman in their 30s.
Yeah.
So as soon as she
Right.
like gets divorced, all her friends are like, "Oh, we got to fix up Helen. Let's find somebody for Helen to marry." And she's like, "Wait a minute. I give me a break. I just got
Right.
divorced. And um and but then, like you say, when she met my dad, they met in December, engaged in February, and married in March. And even to this day, I don't quite understand how that happened. And they stayed married for over 50 years until she passed away. And I did ask, I said, "Mom, how did you decide to get married that fast?" And she just said, "Well, when he said he would do a thing, he did it. And when he said he was going to be at a place, he was there, and usually early, on time, and usually early. And he seemed like he had integrity, and he was a good person." And I asked my dad, and he said, "Well, we didn't believe in sex before marriage back then. So when I decided to like her, I was pretty eager to get married." I was like, "Okay, Dad." And they both had been through the Great Depression and World War II.
Right.
And sometimes I think it's just a different generation. Like,
Yeah.
life is short and uncertain, and I'm not going to overthink it. And let's go.
Right. Right. Well, we're getting to a close. I'm wondering if
Okay,
there's one last passage you would like to leave us with.
sure. This is going to be really short. You mentioned when she went back to Oklahoma and she met his parents, and his mom was really gracious. This is when she meets his grandparents,
Mhm.
and his grandmother has asked her to cook the family a Chinese dinner so they'll know what that's like, because they'd never had any Chinese food before. And here is after dinner. "After dinner, we chatted in the living room for the remainder of the evening. Now, Tom," Grandma Hart asked, "if America goes to war with China, whose side will you be on?"
Oh,
Tom laughed. "On the American side, of course, Grandma. Helen and I are both Americans. We'd both be for America. I nodded my agreement, and Grandma appeared relieved to hear it. And I thought that was appropriate for Asian American Heritage Month, because I think it's easy to look back on that conversation as a kind of quaint story from long ago. But I think a lot of people still think that way. We've heard stories over the last few years where Asian Americans are sometimes told, go back where you came from, particularly at the height of the COVID, even when they were born here. And I think as tensions between the United States and China kind of increase, I hope we can appreciate that honoring one's history and culture and cuisine and heritage, and being interested in the forces that shaped our ancestors and consequently ourselves, doesn't equal political allegiance. We're all Americans.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
And let me look in the, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. And there's a question about if your Helen was Helen J. Harris, the author who...
The friend?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, Helen Harris.
Well, Helen is our very first Friends at Home author.
Oh, wow.
So this is like a really nice, wrap it up with a bow sort of coincidence. That's really wonderful.
Yeah, she's the one that sort of set me on the path of publishing. She gave me some really good advice.
Yeah, that's great. So I don't see any other questions. So I do want to say that Karin is doing a book signing tomorrow at Books Inc. And so the Strength of Water is available at Books Inc. And of course, wherever fine books are sold, but also the library, of course. Oh, good. From Karin, are you thinking about doing another book? Writing another book, or was this just like...
Recently a friend of mine suggested that I write a chapbook, maybe of sort of lessons I've learned from my mother, because I recently wrote some blog post essays, so more about the immigrant daughters experience, and I may also write about my dad, but I don't know if that will be published wider than my family. But he also has a really interesting story. He grew up on the farm in Oklahoma and served in World War II, and so he has his own adventures.
Great. So there is a link in the chat in a moment that will take you directly to the Books Inc. page where you can purchase this book and read it for yourself. You can buy a copy using the link tonight and select the pick up option. So if you're going to be at the book signing tomorrow, you can have a book waiting for you to be picked up to have Karin sign. If you like this talk, it will be available on YouTube. And so feel free to share it with your friends who weren't able to make it tonight. So many thanks to you, Karin, for a very informative conversation. This has been a delight. I've learned a lot from the talk and from the book, definitely also. So
thank you for having me.
Oh, it has been a real pleasure. And a reminder to consider a donation to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library at alamedafriends.com or through the link that is now in the chat. It will help us continue to produce events like this one. Our next Friends at Home event will be a couple docent talks, and Ansel Adams in Our Time will be Wednesday, May 17th, and then Vera Mirror on Wednesday, the 24th. Our next author talk will be Wednesday, June 28th at 6:30 p.m. We will be discussing You Are Not Expected to Understand This, 26 Lines of Code That Changed the World. It's 26 essays on pivotal moments in technology that affect our lives today, including the origins of the like button on Facebook and the first pop-up ad. We'll be joined by the editor, Tori Bosch, and local author, David Castle, in an evening that will be fun and geared towards non-geeks. So please join us for that. I would like to thank the team that makes these events happen: David Beal, Karin Manuel, Karen Romer, Renisha Robinson, Kumar Fantz, Karen Butter, Catherine Adcox, Billy Reisenschmidt, and Becky Sear. And a special thanks again to Karen Jensen for an informative and entertaining program. And finally, thanks to you for joining us this evening.